Malcolm Granger dropped the paper on the table like it was nothing, like it was a receipt for a sack of flour. "Sign it, Robert, or I take the ranch by Monday." Evelyn Hart stood in the doorway of her family's kitchen and read the single line that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her father and about herself. In exchange for full debt forgiveness, Robert Hart agrees to surrender his daughter, Evelyn May Hart, age 27, into the household service and personal custody of Malcolm Granger, effective immediately. Her father's hand was already moving toward the pen. She couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. The woman who had spent 7 years keeping this family alive, mending fences in frozen mud, stretching every last dollar until it screamed, was being handed over like a piece of livestock by the one man she had never stopped trusting. If that had been you standing in that doorway, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The morning it happened, Evelyn had been up since 4. That was nothing unusual. 4 in the morning was when the world still belonged to her, before her younger brother Thomas needed his boots laced and his breakfast made, before her mother's cough started rattling the thin walls of the bedroom, before her father shuffled out with that look on his face. The look she had learned to read years ago, the one that meant he'd spent another night awake, counting numbers that never added up. She'd lit the stove, put on coffee, cut the last of the bread, and decided she would ride into Silver Creek that afternoon for more flour, more salt pork, and maybe, if she could figure the arithmetic right, a small wedge of hard cheese that Thomas had been asking about for 2 weeks. The ranch was struggling. That was the polite word for it. Dying was more accurate, but Evelyn had never been the kind of woman who said the word out loud, because saying it out loud made it real, and she had spent 7 years refusing to let it become real. Her father, Robert Hart, was not a bad man. That was the most complicated thing about him. He was not cruel, not lazy, not indifferent. He had loved this land with a passion that bordered on religious, had worked it with his hands until those hands were more scar than skin. But Robert Hart had one flaw that ran through him like a crack in a foundation wall. He was a man who believed that the next season would fix everything. The next harvest, the next good year, the next loan. And Malcolm Granger had known that about Robert Hart for a very long time. Evelyn was at the stove when she heard the wheels. She didn't look up immediately. Riders came through Silver Creek's edge often enough. Drifters, supply wagons, the occasional circuit preacher. But something about the particular sound of those wheels on the dry September road made the small hairs on her arms stand up, and she set down her spoon without entirely knowing why. She looked through the window. The buggy was black. The horse pulling it was too fine for this road, too well-fed, too clean. And Malcolm Granger sat upright in the seat with his silver-tipped walking stick resting across his knees like a scepter, wearing a dark coat that cost more than everything in the Hart family's house combined. Evelyn had seen Granger before. Everyone in Silver Creek had. He owned the lending office on Main Street, the largest parcel of land in the county, 3 of the 5 buildings in town proper, and, though it was spoken about only in whispers, the loyalty of 2 members of the county council. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had a smile that never touched his eyes. He was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by walking into it. She watched him climb down from the buggy with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who had never once hurried for anything, because the world had always waited for him. Her father came out of the barn. That was the thing that made Evelyn's stomach drop. Robert Hart came out of the barn before Granger even knocked, which meant Robert Hart had been expecting him. She moved to the front door without thinking. She didn't open it. She stood just inside the frame and listened through the cracked wood the way she'd done as a child during thunderstorms, pressing her ear to solid things because solid things felt safer. She heard her father say, "Mr. Granger, you're early." She heard Granger say, "I'm always exactly on time, Robert." She heard the silence that followed, the kind of silence that 2 men share when one of them owes the other something he cannot pay. Then she heard her father say, "Come inside." She stepped back from the door, moved to the far side of the kitchen. picked up her spoon again and stirred the pot that didn't need stirring because she needed something to do with her hands, because every instinct she had was screaming that she should not be in this room, but she could not make herself leave it. They came in. Her father's eyes found her immediately, and what she saw in them was the thing she had never, in 27 years of living with this man, seen there before. Shame. Deep and ugly and desperate. "Evelyn?" His voice was wrong, too careful. "Could you give us a minute, sweetheart?" She looked at Granger. Granger was already looking at her, had been looking at her since the moment he walked through the door, she realized, with an attention that was not casual, not polite. It was the look of a man examining an asset. "I'll just finish up breakfast," she said. "Evelyn?" Her father's voice had something crumbling inside it. "Please." She went. She walked down the hall to the small room she shared with nothing but a washstand and a single shelf of books, closed the door behind her, and stood in the middle of the floor with her arms wrapped around herself, listening to the low rumble of voices through the wall. She could not make out words, only tone. And the tone was wrong. Granger's voice flat and businesslike. Her father's voice rising and falling the way a man's does when he is losing an argument he never had a chance of winning. She should have left. She knew that later, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone and find something unpleasant living underneath. She should have saddled her horse and ridden into Silver Creek, and given whatever this was time to resolve itself. But she was Robert Hart's daughter, and Robert Hart's daughters did not run from things. So when she heard her father's voice rise above the murmur, when she heard him say, almost clearly, "She doesn't need to know the details, Malcolm, just that it's settled," she came back out. She walked down the hall. She opened the kitchen door. She stood in the frame. Granger had a single piece of paper on the table, a pen laid beside it. Her father stood 3 feet away with his head bowed and his big scarred hands hanging at his sides like dead weight. Granger looked up at her with that smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Miss Hart," he said pleasantly, "we were just finishing up some business." She looked at the paper. She could not read all of it from where she stood. Her father had placed himself slightly between her and the table, not enough to block, just enough to make it clear he didn't want her seen. But she moved closer, because she was Robert Hart's daughter, and Robert Hart's daughters did not stop at the edge of things. She read the line, the single relevant line. The kitchen went completely silent. She could hear the coffee on the stove beginning to boil over. She read it again. In exchange for full debt forgiveness, Robert Hart agrees to surrender his daughter, Evelyn May Hart, age 27, into the household service and personal custody of Malcolm Granger, effective immediately. The coffee hissed and bubbled against the hot iron, and nobody moved. "Dad?" Her voice came out very quiet. That scared her more than anything else, that she had expected anger and found something colder underneath it. "How much do we owe him?" Robert Hart could not look at her. That told her everything. 3 years of notes, he said to the floor, plus interest, plus the fee from the East Pasture water rights. He swallowed. "Evelyn, I tried every other—" "How much?" $4,200. She had been mending a fence last week with wire that kept snapping because she had bought the cheapest grade available. She had been watering a garden with a bucket because the irrigation pipe had a crack in it, and she hadn't bought a new one yet because new pipe cost money. She had been cutting Thomas's portion of supper slightly larger than her own for 8 months and pretending she wasn't hungry. $4,000. Money they would never see in a single year. Money that her father had apparently borrowed over 3 years without telling her, and had apparently never found a way to pay back, and had apparently decided could be resolved by writing her name on a piece of paper. "No," she said. The word was simple. It wasn't loud. It didn't shake. Granger tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he hears something unexpected from a source he hadn't considered worth expecting anything from. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice carrying the particular patience of someone who has never been told no and found it amusing rather than threatening. "Your father and I have an agreement." "My father doesn't own me," she said, "so he can't give me to you." "He's not giving you to me. It's household service. A legitimate contract." "A contract that treats a person as a debt payment," she said. "That's not legitimate. That's something else entirely." Something moved behind Granger's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something more like adjustment, like a man recalibrating, deciding whether the obstacle in front of him required force or patience. "Robert," he said, not looking away from Evelyn. "Sign the paper." Her father's hand moved toward the pen. "Don't." Her voice cracked on the word. Just slightly, just enough to be human. "Dad, don't you sign that paper." Robert Hart stopped. His hand hovered, his chin dropped lower. "We'll lose the ranch," he said. "Evelyn, we'll lose everything Monday. I can't—" His voice broke apart. "I can't let your mother end up with nowhere to go. She's sick. You know she's sick. Where would she go?" And there it was, the thing Granger had known before he ever climbed into his black buggy that morning. The thing he had calculated as carefully as any interest rate. Robert Hart's weakness was not the land or the money or the pride. Robert Hart's weakness was his family, and he had put his family in the room to watch. Evelyn looked at her father's face, the face she had loved for 27 years, the face that had looked at her the morning she was born and that had carried her on its shoulders when she was small enough to fit there. And she felt something in her chest split cleanly in two. She reached for the pen. She would sign it herself if she had to, because her mother was sick and Thomas was 16, and this was what you did when you loved people more than you loved your own dignity. The door opened. Not a knock, not a call from outside. The front door simply opened, and a man stepped through it as though he had every right in the world to be standing in the Hart family kitchen uninvited, because something about the way he moved suggested he had learned a long time ago that waiting for permission was a luxury you didn't always have. He was tall, not dramatically so, but solidly, the way mountains are tall, like the height was structural rather than decorative. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that the Wyoming sun had worked on for years, leaving its honest marks. His coat was plain. His boots were well worn. He held his hat in his left hand. In his right hand, he held a banker's envelope. His eyes went to the paper on the table. They stayed there exactly long enough to read it. Then they moved to Evelyn. Something passed across his face, fast, controlled, almost invisible. But it was there. Something that looked like fury held on an extremely short leash. "Caleb Ashford," Granger said, and his voice had changed. Not much, just enough. The pleasantness had thinned slightly, the way a man's voice does when he encounters the one variable he didn't plan for. "This is a private matter." "I heard you were out this way," Caleb said. He was looking at Robert Hart now. "Robert, is 4,200 the figure?" Robert Hart stared at him. "Caleb, you can't— Is that the figure?" A long pause. "Yes." Caleb Ashford set the banker's envelope on the table directly on top of the paper set. Directly, flatly, with a finality that was almost theatrical in its quietness, and looked at Malcolm Granger. "Count it if you want," he said. "It's all there. 4,200 in a document releasing the Hart property from all claims, liens, and encumbrances, effective today. My attorney prepared it last night." He paused. "You'll sign the release, Mr. Granger, or I'll be at the county courthouse when it opens at 8 Monday morning with documentation of 4 separate irregularities in the loan instruments you've filed against 3 other families in this county. Your choice. You have about 30 seconds to make it." The kitchen was absolutely still. Granger did not move for a long moment. He looked at the envelope. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Evelyn. And whatever he saw in her face, standing straight and white-knuckled by the stove, was something he had clearly not expected to encounter this morning. He picked up his pen. He signed the release. He gathered his own document, the one with Evelyn's name on it, and he folded it and put it in his pocket with the precise movements of a man who was absorbing a loss and already beginning to plan around it. "This isn't finished," he said. He meant it for Caleb, but he looked at Evelyn when he said it. "No," Caleb agreed calmly. "It isn't." Granger left. The black buggy's wheels made the same sound going out that they had made coming in. Too fine, too clean, wrong for this road. For a long time, nobody in the kitchen moved. Thomas appeared in the hallway doorway in his socks, clearly having heard everything from the back of the house and having had the good sense, or the fear, to stay out of it until now. His face was the color of old ash. Her father sat down heavily in his chair. He put his face in his hands. "I didn't know what else to do," he said. It was not an excuse. It was just the truth, and it was worse that way. Evelyn set down the pen she hadn't realized she was still holding. She looked at Caleb Ashford, this man who had walked through her door uninvited, who had spent what she could only imagine was a significant portion of everything he had, and who was now standing in the middle of her kitchen, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has done what he came to do and is now simply waiting to see what comes next. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because it was the right thing," he said. And then, after a beat, with the directness of someone who had decided honesty was less complicated than performance, "And because I know your family, and because I've known for a long time that Granger was going to do something like this to someone." "You spent $4,000. "I did. On us. On stopping him," he said quietly. "You happened to be in the way." She didn't know whether to laugh at that or not. She decided not to. "We can't pay you back," she said. "You know that." "I know that." "Then what do you want?" He looked at her for a moment with the careful, unhurried attention of someone reading something complicated. "I've got a ranch up on the mountain," he said. "North of the creek, up past the ridge. It's more land than one man can manage alone, and I've been managing it alone for 4 years. I need someone who knows how to work." He paused. "I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm not asking for anything that isn't fair wages and honest labor. You'd have your own room with a key that you keep. You'd work your own hours with your own authority over the domestic side of the operation." Another pause. "And you can leave any time you want. No paper, no contract. Just work. In your own word and mine." Evelyn studied him. She had grown up in a world where men offered women things in exchange for other things, and the exchange was rarely what it appeared to be. She had learned to read the gap between what men said and what they meant. She was good at it. She had to be. She read Caleb Ashford. She could not find the gap. "I need a day to think," she said. "Take 2, he said, and put his hat back on his head and walked out the door. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he left, listening to the coffee finish boiling over on the stove, listening to her father's ragged breathing, listening to Thomas shift his weight in the hallway, and feeling, underneath the shock, underneath the fury at her father, underneath the cold residue of what Malcolm Granger's pen had been about to do to her life, something she had not felt in a very long time. Not gratitude. She wasn't ready for that yet. Something quieter than that. Something that felt cautiously like the first breath after a very long time of not quite breathing enough. She walked to the stove and moved the coffee pot off the heat. She looked out the window at the road where the black buggy's dust was still settling. Then she looked at the mountains, north, where the ridge caught the morning light and held it. She did not know yet what she was going to decide. She did not know yet what Caleb Ashford was, beneath the plainness and the banker's envelope and the 30-second ultimatum delivered to the most powerful man in Silver Creek like it was nothing remarkable. She did not know yet that he had been watching out for her family for 7 years, that the day she had mended the east fence alone in a February ice storm, he had ridden past at a distance and turned back twice before making himself keep going, that he knew the name of every book on her single-bedroom shelf because he had asked Thomas about them once, casually, the way a man asks about something he's been thinking about for longer than he means to admit. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that for the first time in as long as she could remember, someone had walked into a room where her worth was being decided and had refused to let the calculation stand. And that, she thought, looking out at the mountains, was something. That was something worth thinking about for 2 days. She took both days. She spent the first one angry, at her father, at the situation, at herself for the half-second when her hand had reached for that pen. She split firewood for 2 hours in the early afternoon, which wasn't necessary because they had enough, but her arms needed something to do that wasn't thinking. Thomas stayed out of her way with the good instincts of a 16-year-old who understood that his sister's silence had different temperatures, and this one was the kind you didn't walk into. Her father tried to talk to her that evening. He sat down across from her at the supper table after Thomas had gone to bed, and he opened his mouth 3 times before anything came out. I was going to tell you, he said. When? She said. Not a question. When I had a solution. You had a solution, she said. It had my name on it. Robert Hart looked at his hands. I know. Did you think I wouldn't find out until after you'd signed it? He didn't answer, which was its own answer, and she pushed back from the table and went to bed without finishing her supper. She lay in the dark for a long time listening to her mother's slow, labored breathing through the wall, and she thought about the look on Granger's face when he'd put that piece of paper in his pocket. Not defeated, rearranging. There was a difference, and it mattered. The second day she rode out alone, not toward Silver Creek and not toward the mountain, just out along the east fence line where she'd spent so many mornings that the horse knew the route without being told. The land was dry this time of year, the grass gone yellow-brown, and the fence posts leaned at angles that she had been meaning to fix for 3 seasons running. She rode slowly and looked at it all. The posts, the wire, the cracked earth, the thin cattle grazing in the far corner of the pasture. And she tried to be honest with herself the way she was rarely honest with anyone else. They couldn't keep going. That was the truth. Even without the debt, even with Granger's claim erased, the ranch was bleeding from a dozen small wounds that had never properly healed. Her father's back had been bad for 2 years. The north well had dropped 6 feet over the summer. And her mother's illness, which the doctor in Silver Creek called a weakness of the lungs, and which Evelyn privately called by its real name, was only going one direction. She could stay. She could keep mending things that kept breaking, keep stretching money that kept running out, keep being the load-bearing wall of a structure that was slowly sinking into the ground. She knew how to do that. She had been doing it for 7 years. Or she could go up the mountain and learn what Caleb Ashford's offer actually was, underneath the plain language and the straightforward eyes. She turned the horse north at the end of the fence line. She didn't go all the way up that day. She rode far enough to see the ridge, far enough to see the smoke from what she assumed was his chimney rising thin and straight against the morning sky. And then she turned back. But she had already made her decision somewhere between the leaning fence post and the thin cattle, and turning back was just the last test she gave herself, to see if she'd change her mind once she could actually see the place. She didn't. She told her father that evening. He nodded slowly, and she could see him working through multiple emotions in sequence. Relief, guilt, a complicated kind of grief that she didn't have words for and didn't try to name. He started to say something about being sorry, and she stopped him. Don't, she said. Not yet. Maybe later. She packed one bag. She left the second best quilt for her mother and took the oldest one for herself. She left Thomas a note that said, only take care of them and fix the north post before winter, and put it under his coffee cup where he'd find it in the morning. She rode up the mountain at first light. Caleb was already in the yard when she arrived, which meant he'd either heard the horse from inside or he'd been up long enough that being in the yard at dawn was just where he was. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything triumphant or welcoming or significant. He just said, "Coffee's on," and walked back toward the house, and she followed him. The ranch was not what she expected, which meant she'd been forming expectations without realizing it. She'd imagined something either worse than the Hart place, a bachelor's neglected wreckage, or suspiciously better, which would have meant money she couldn't account for. It was neither. It was a working ranch that had been maintained by someone who cared about function over appearance, which meant the important things were solid and the cosmetic things were ignored. The house had good bones and needed paint. The barn was sound. The fencing on the south pasture was newer than anything she'd seen on her father's land in a decade. He poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table to her without asking how she took it. She took it black, which he would have had no way of knowing. She didn't mention it. "There are 12 head of cattle," he said, sitting down across from her with the directness of a man who had decided to get to the practical things before the personal ones, which she respected immediately. 8 good ones, 4 I'm not sure about. The south pasture needs rotating next month. The root cellar is well stocked, but the shelving needs replacing before it collapses under its own weight. The house," he paused, "the house needs work. I've been putting it off." "What kind of work?" "The north window leaks when it rains from the east. The stovepipe in the second bedroom needs resetting. The floorboards in the hall have soft spots. He looked at his coffee. I'm not asking you to do any of that. I'm just telling you what it is. I'm not afraid of work, she said. I know that, he said. That's not why I told you. She looked at him. Then why? He met her eyes. Because you should know what you're walking into before you're already in it. And because the last person who came up here to work for me left after 3 weeks because I hadn't told them how hard the winters were, and I didn't want to do that again. How hard are the winters? Hard, he said simply. She nodded. She drank her coffee. It was strong enough to be startling, and she decided she liked that. The room she got was small. It had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which she valued more than size. The bed was narrow, but the mattress wasn't ruined. He handed her the key without ceremony, just placed it in her palm with the same matter-of-fact energy he seemed to apply to everything, and went back downstairs to his own work. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, closed her hand around the key. It was a small thing. It weighed almost nothing. She couldn't explain, even to herself, why it hit her as hard as it did. She put it in her pocket and went downstairs to start learning where everything was. The first 2 weeks were the careful, provisional kind of time that happens between people who don't know each other well enough to be comfortable but have committed to a shared space. They found a working rhythm without discussing it. She handled the house and the kitchen and the garden beds. He handled the livestock and the fencing and the heavier outdoor work, and somewhere in the middle they met to make decisions about things that required 2 people to decide. He didn't give her orders. She didn't ask for them. When she thought something was being done wrong, and on the 3rd day she thought the root cellar shelving situation was worse than he'd described and needed immediate attention, not eventual attention, she said so directly, and he listened without arguing and said, "Then let's do it now." And they did. She appreciated that. She'd known men who listened to suggestions with their mouths and dismissed them with their eyes. Caleb Ashford either said yes or explained why no, and both answers were given straight. He was not easy company, exactly. He wasn't cold, but he was contained, the kind of man who had spent enough time alone that solitude had become a natural state rather than something he suffered through. He spoke when he had something to say. When he didn't, he was quiet in a way that was comfortable rather than hostile, which she discovered was a rarer quality than she'd previously appreciated. She was 3 weeks in when she found the first ledger. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a tool he'd mentioned was somewhere in the back of the storage room off the kitchen, and she'd moved a crate to look behind it, and the ledger had been sitting underneath, unlocked, unremarkable looking, just a worn brown cover, and it had fallen open when the crate shifted. She would have closed it. She was not a woman who read other people's private papers, but she saw her father's name. Hart, East Pasture, Water Rights Claim, Granger Filing, August 1882. She sat down on the floor of the storage room with the ledger in her hands. It was not Caleb's personal ledger. It was something else. A record. Meticulous, patient, organized by date and by family name. There were 12 names she recognized from Silver Creek and the surrounding area. Below each name was a record of transactions, loans, interest rates, property claims, council decisions, with dates and dollar amounts, and in several cases, notes about the specific language Granger had used. She looked at the earliest entry. January 1879. 3 years before she'd ever met Caleb Ashford. He had been tracking this for 4 years, quietly, alone, with the patience of someone who was building something specific and waiting until it was enough. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard him come in from outside. She heard his boots stop at the kitchen door, a pause. "Evelyn?" "In here," she said. He came through the doorway and saw her on the floor with the ledger, and something in his face did the thing she'd noticed it occasionally doing. That fast, controlled shift that he usually managed to contain before it showed. This time, it didn't fully contain. "How long have you been tracking him?" she said. He leaned against the door frame, not defensive, considering. 4 years in that book, he said. But I started paying attention 6 years before that, when he took the Mercer family's land and the council let him do it. The Mercer family. She knew that name. They had lived 2 miles south of the Hart place before she was old enough to remember them clearly, and then they hadn't. She'd always understood it vaguely as a family that had moved on. He took their land. He lent them money at a rate he never disclosed in writing, Caleb said, and when they defaulted, he presented documents to the county council that had numbers in them that weren't the same numbers as the original loan. The original copies disappeared. The Mercers had no proof, no lawyer, no money to fight it, and 3 children. He paused. They went to Kansas. Last I heard. Evelyn looked down at the ledger, at the 12 names, at 4 years of quiet, careful evidence. You were building a case, she said. I was trying to. For who? That was the problem, he said, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that wasn't composure, something older and more worn. County council is 2/3 in his pocket. Local law looks the other way. I wrote to the territorial court twice. Nothing. He straightened up from the doorframe. I needed more. More names, more documentation, more people willing to put their names on a statement. And people were scared, Evelyn. They're still scared. When a man can take your land and your livelihood and the county apparatus will help him do it, you learn to be quiet pretty fast. She turned a page. There was her family's name again. A longer entry this time, dated across several years. Notes about the loan terms, about the interest compounding, about a note she hadn't known existed regarding the water rights to the east pasture. She read it slowly. He was coming for us for 3 years, she said. Yes. And you watched him. I watched him, Caleb said, and she heard the thing underneath that admission, the part that cost him something to say. I was still building the record. I told myself I needed more time, more documentation, and that was true. And it was also... He stopped. Also what? A long pause. Also easier than acting before I was certain I could win. She looked up at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she noted because it would have been easy to look away right then, and he didn't. Well, she said, you acted. Not soon enough, he said quietly. She closed the ledger. She thought about that for a moment, about the difference between the man she'd been building a picture of over 3 weeks and this additional dimension of him, the patience, the guilt, the 4 years of a ledger kept in a storage room. What do you need to make this work? She said. The case, what's actually missing? He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. A federal attorney, someone with authority that Granger can't reach. The territorial court ignored me because I'm one rancher with handwritten notes. But if I could get a federal officer interested... And witnesses, she said. You need the families to talk. They won't. Not without someone asking them the right way, she said. Not without someone they trust. She stood up, dusting off her skirt. Do you know which families he's currently holding loans against? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. 7 that I know of. 7 families, she said. 7 conversations. She held out the ledger. Start with who's closest to defaulting. That's where he has the most pressure on them. And pressure, when you shift it in the right direction, can work for you instead of against you. Caleb took the ledger. He was still looking at her with that unreadable expression. You've been up here 3 weeks, he said. I'm a fast learner, she said, and walked past him back into the kitchen to start supper. He stood in the storage room doorway a moment longer. She heard him exhale. Slow, quiet, the sound of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just felt another pair of hands on the weight. The first family she approached was the Lindqvists, a Swedish couple with a farm 8 miles north of Silver Creek, who had been 3 months behind on their loan payments for almost a year. She knew Britta Lindqvist slightly, had traded preserves with her at the autumn market 2 years running, and she judged, rightly, that Britta was the one to talk to first. She rode out on a Tuesday, alone. Caleb had offered to come. She'd said no. If you come, it's 2 people showing up to ask a favor, she said. If I come alone, it's a neighbor visiting. He'd considered that, and nodded and not argued, which she was coming to understand was how he operated when he recognized that someone else's judgment was better than his on a specific thing. Britta Lindqvist came to the door with flour on her hands and a wariness in her eyes that Evelyn recognized. The wariness of a woman who had learned to be careful about who she opened doors to. Evelyn stayed on the step. She didn't push forward. She said she'd brought preserves, set them on the rail, and asked how the children were. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing. about the dry summer, about the price of salt pork, about whether the creek was going to run low again before October. And then, when Britta's shoulders had dropped 2 inches and she'd invited Evelyn inside for water, Evelyn set her cup on the table and said quietly, "Britta, what did your loan papers actually say when you signed them? What rate did he tell you?" Britta went very still. "I'm not here to make trouble for you," Evelyn said. "I'm here because I've seen what he nearly did to my family, and I've seen the records Caleb Ashford has been keeping, and I think you and Henrik aren't the only ones who got a different deal on paper than the one you were told about out loud." Silence. 6%, Britta said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said 6%. He said it twice. Henrik remembers. We both remember." She looked at her hands. The paper said 11. Evelyn kept her voice very steady. "Would you be willing to say that to a federal attorney? In writing?" The word federal made Britta flinch. "They'd take the farm." "They'd lose the farm if Granger isn't stopped," Evelyn said. "He doesn't let go, Britta. He keeps tightening. You know that." A long silence. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, one of the Lindqvist children was calling to another in Swedish, something that sounded cheerful and unconcerned, the way children sound when they don't know yet what the adults in their house are worried about. "I need to talk to Henrik," Britta said. "Of course," Evelyn said. "I'll come back." She came back Thursday. Henrik Lindqvist was a big, quiet man who said almost nothing for the first hour, and then, when he finally spoke, said everything clearly and without hesitation. The rate he'd been told, the rate on the paper, the meeting with the council member who'd suggested it was in his best interest not to make noise about the discrepancy. Evelyn wrote down every word. Her handwriting wasn't pretty, but it was precise. 3 families in the first 2 weeks. The Lindqvists. The Calloway widow, who had a story that was worse than Evelyn had expected, and told it with a dry-eyed steadiness that made Evelyn's chest ache. And the Reyes family, who at first refused to speak to her at all, and then, on her 3rd visit, had Martin Reyes show her the 2 sets of documents he had kept. The copy Granger's office had given him, and the copy he'd secretly made of the original before they took it back, claiming they needed to file it. 2 sets of documents with different numbers on them for the same loan. She rode back up the mountain that evening later than she'd meant to, and Caleb was sitting on the porch in the dark because the sun had gone down 2 hours ago and she hadn't come back when she'd said she would. He stood up when he heard her horse, and she could see by the set of his shoulders that he'd been worried and was now calibrating whether to say so. She saved him the trouble. "Martin Reyes has 2 copies of his loan document," she said, dismounting. "Different interest figures. Same signature page." Caleb went very still. "That's fraud," he said. "That's not just predatory lending. That's documented fraud." "I know what it is," she said. He stepped off the porch. He took the horse's reins from her. Not because she couldn't manage them, she registered, but because his hands needed something to do. He stood there for a moment with the horse's reins in his hands and said nothing, working through what she'd just told him with the expression of a man who has been building toward something for 4 years and has just seen the foundation become solid under his feet. "Martin will testify," he said. "Martin was angrier than any of them," she said. "He's been carrying those 2 pieces of paper for 3 years, waiting for someone to tell him they mattered." Caleb exhaled. "We need to get to a federal attorney. There's a man in Cheyenne, James Whitmore. I've written to him twice. He never answered, but if I go in person, with this—" she said. He looked at her. "We go to Cheyenne," she said. "You're not walking into a federal attorney's office alone with handwritten notes and a second-hand account. I go with you. I've spoken to these families. I know what they said and how they said it and what they're willing to put in writing. It could get complicated," he said. "If Granger finds out we're building a case, he already thinks it isn't finished," she said. "Remember? He said so on his way out my father's door." A pause. "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "He did." "Then he's already planning something," she said, "which means we don't have as much time as we thought." He was looking at her in the dark with an expression she couldn't fully make out, and she was too tired and too focused to try. "I'll write to Whitmore tonight," he said. "Let him know we're coming." "Write to the other 2 families he's wrong that we haven't talked to yet first," she said. "I want at least 5 names on a statement before we walk into that office." He was quiet a moment. "You've been thinking about this all day." "I've been thinking about this since I was sitting on your storage room floor," she said. "Good night, Caleb." She went inside. She heard him stand in the yard for another moment, horse still in hand, letter presumably forming itself in his head, before she heard his boots on the porch steps. She went upstairs. She took the key from her pocket and held it for a moment before she unlocked the door, a habit she'd developed without noticing, this brief pause before turning it, as though the small act of unlocking her own door was something worth marking. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the east window, dark now, the mountains invisible behind it. 5 families, 2 sets of documents, 1 federal attorney who hadn't answered 2 letters. She thought about Britta Lindqvist's hands going still on the table, about the Calloway widow's dry eyes, about Martin Reyes pulling 2 pieces of paper out of a tin box he kept under a floorboard, spreading them on the table, smoothing them flat with his palms like they were something precious. Which they were, she understood. They were his proof. They were 3 years of knowing he'd been wronged and having nobody willing to look. She thought about Granger in her family's kitchen, dropping that paper like it was nothing. She thought about 7 families still living under his reach, making their payments on loans they couldn't afford at rates they hadn't agreed to, staying quiet because quiet felt safer than the alternative. She lay back on the narrow mattress and stared at the ceiling and felt the shape of what they were building. The ledger, the testimonies, the Reyes documents, the letter to Cheyenne, and it was not yet enough. She knew that. A federal attorney was only a beginning, and a beginning was not a victory. But she also knew this. 3 weeks ago, she had been standing in a kitchen with her hand reaching for a pen to sign herself away, and tonight she was lying on a mountain with a key in her pocket and 5 families' worth of truth in her notebook. The distance between those 2 things was not geography. It was a choice, repeated, daily, in the small and unglamorous work of deciding not to be quiet when being quiet was easier. She turned over onto her side. She closed her eyes. Somewhere downstairs she heard the scratch of a pen on paper. Caleb, writing the letter to Whitmore, working late the way he always worked late, alone and methodical and patient in a way that had once looked to her like passivity, but which she now understood was something else entirely. It was persistence, the quiet, expensive kind. She fell asleep to the sound of it. What she did not know, what she would not know for some time yet, was that one of Silver Creek's council members had been at the general store that afternoon and had seen her horse outside the Calloway widow's house, and that by the time she was asleep on her narrow mountain mattress, a message was already making its way to Malcolm Granger's desk. It said, "The Hart woman is asking questions," and below that, in Granger's own handwriting, because he had not yet sent his reply but had written it immediately upon reading the note, as a man does when he has been anticipating something and has therefore already decided what to do about it. Then it is time to remind her what questions cost. The reply from James Whitmore came 8 days after Caleb sent the letter. It was short, 3 sentences. It said he had received previous correspondence, that he was familiar with Granger's name in a general capacity, and that he would meet with them on the 14th of October if they could make the journey to Cheyenne. He did not say he believed them. He did not say he was interested. He said he would meet with them, which was exactly 1 degree warmer than the 2 non-answers he had sent before. And Caleb set the letter on the kitchen table without comment. Evelyn read it twice. "He's cautious." "He's a federal attorney," Caleb said. "Cautious is probably how they stay employed." "We need to give him something he can't be cautious about," she said. "The Reyes documents alone aren't enough. 1 family's word against Granger's, even with 2 versions of the same paper, but Granger will say it was a clerical error. He'll have an explanation ready. He always has an explanation ready." "What do you want to do?" She was quiet for a moment, standing by the window with the letter in her hand. Outside, the aspens on the ridge had started turning. That particular yellow that only happens for about 2 weeks before the cold takes it, vivid and brief and slightly desperate looking. "The council member," she said. "The one who told Henrik Lindqvist not to make noise. Do you know his name?" "Patterson," Caleb said. "Gerald Patterson. Runs the feed store on 2nd Street." "Has Granger ever paid him in something other than money?" Caleb looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Land. Water rights. A favorable ruling on something Patterson needed personally." She set the letter down. Men like Granger don't buy loyalty with cash if they can help it. Cash leaves records, favors leave gratitude, and gratitude is harder to trace. Caleb was quiet. She could see him pulling something up from memory, sorting through it. Patterson had a boundary dispute 3 years ago, he said slowly. East side of his property, neighbor claimed Patterson's fence was 6 feet over the line. Could have gone either way. The council ruled in Patterson's favor. He paused. Granger chaired that session. And the neighbor? Moved away the following spring. Another pause. His name is in the ledger. Evelyn looked at the ceiling for a moment. The shape of it was becoming clearer. Not a single corrupt transaction, but a system, each piece supporting the others, each favor creating an obligation that Granger could call in whenever he needed the machinery to move in a particular direction. It was patient work. It had taken years to build, and it would take something substantial to dismantle. We need Patterson on record, she said, not as a witness against Granger. He'll never do that voluntarily. But if a federal attorney asks him direct questions under oath about that council session, about what he knew about Granger's involvement in the Lindqvist loan, he'll lie, Caleb said. People who lie under oath to a federal officer tend to create problems for themselves, she said. And people who are about to create problems for themselves sometimes decide that honesty is the better risk. She looked at Caleb. We don't need him to volunteer. We just need Whitmore to ask. Caleb was looking at her with that expression again. The one she'd started cataloging without meaning to, the one that appeared when she said something that landed somewhere specific in him. She had begun to understand that it wasn't admiration exactly, or not only that. It was something older and more complicated, and she filed it away for a time when she had the space to think about it properly. I'll write to Whitmore again, Caleb said. Tell him about Patterson. Give him the council session date. Send him the ledger entries too, she said. The originals, not copies. He looked at her sharply. Those are the only... I know what they are, she said. That's why we send them. Copies say we're cautious. Originals say we trust him with the real thing. And a man who's been cautious his whole career will notice that difference. A long pause. All right, he said. They left for Cheyenne on the 12th to give themselves 2 days of travel and one evening to organize everything before the meeting. Evelyn told her father she was going, not asking, telling, which was a distinction Robert Hart absorbed with the quiet of a man who understood he had forfeited certain opinions. She did not bring Thomas into it because Thomas was 16, and she didn't want him carrying anything he didn't need to carry. The journey was 2 days by horse and then rail, and it was not comfortable or scenic or anything worth describing at length, except for one conversation that happened on the second morning when they were 2 hours from the station and the road was flat enough that they could ride side by side without one of them dropping back. Caleb had been quieter than usual since they'd left, which was saying something. She finally said, "What's bothering you?" He didn't answer immediately. She had learned that about him, that his silences were not avoidance but actual thought, that if she waited instead of pressing, she usually got a real answer. What Granger said, he said, on his way out your father's door. This isn't finished. I've been thinking about what that means practically. He's had 2 weeks since then. He knows we're building something, or suspects it, and Granger doesn't wait to see what you're building before he acts. You think he'll do something before Cheyenne? I think he already has, Caleb said. I just don't know what yet. She thought about that. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October air that felt like a blade against the face if you moved through it at any speed, and she pulled her coat tighter and thought about Granger in his office with that note. The Hart woman is asking questions, and about what a man like that did with 2 weeks and a motive. My family, she said. They're all right, Caleb said. I asked the Lindqvist to keep an eye. Henrik rides past your father's place twice a week anyway. She looked at him. You asked them before we left, she said. Not a question. Yes. When did you arrange that? The day before we left. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me. I didn't want you deciding not to come, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an apology and not quite an explanation. Something in between, slightly uncomfortable, the sound of a man who has just realized that his reason for not telling her something was not as considerate as he'd thought it was. Caleb, she said, If you make decisions about my family without telling me because you've decided I'll react a certain way, that's the same kind of thing we're writing to Cheyenne to fight against. A long silence. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. She nodded once, let it sit for a moment. Then, thank you for asking them, he exhaled. You're welcome. They didn't talk for another mile, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, cleared of something rather than holding it. James Whitmore's office in Cheyenne was on the second floor of a building that smelled like law, old paper, and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of rooms where serious things get decided in inadequate light. Whitmore himself was around 50, with a gray beard kept neat and watchful eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles that he had a habit of adjusting without apparently needing to, which Evelyn read as a thinking gesture rather than a vision problem. He shook Caleb's hand. He shook Evelyn's hand, which she noted because not all men of his position did. He looked at the materials they'd laid on his desk, the ledger, the Reyes documents, the signed statements from the Lindqvists and the Calloway widow and 3 other families, and he read in silence for a very long time. Neither of them spoke. Evelyn had decided before they walked in that the worst thing they could do was fill the silence with more words. The documents either said what they said or they didn't. Whitmore took off his spectacles, cleaned them with a cloth from his vest pocket, put them back on. Miss Hart, he said, walk me through the day Granger came to your father's house, in your own words, at your own pace. So she did. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you tell a thing when you've already processed the worst of the feeling about it and what's left is just the fact of it. She told him about the paper on the table, about the single line with her name on it, about her father's hand moving toward the pen. Whitmore listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, And you saw this document yourself. You read that specific language. Yes. The document Granger took with him when he left. Yes. So we don't have the document itself. No, she said. But we have my testimony, my father's testimony, if needed, and the established pattern of behavior across 11 other families that makes the existence of such a document entirely consistent with how Malcolm Granger operates. She leaned forward slightly. Mr. Whitmore, that document was the most visible thing he's done, the most obvious. Men like him don't make obvious moves unless they're confident there are no consequences. The fact that he walked into a family home in broad daylight with a piece of paper that treated a woman as a debt payment tells you exactly how untouchable he believes he is. Whitmore looked at her for a moment. You have a legal mind, Miss Hart, he said. I have an angry one, she said. It's not the same thing. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Gerald Patterson, he said, turning to a page in the ledger. You believe he can be compelled to testify about the council session. I believe that a man who has received favors from Malcolm Granger and then is asked about those favors by a federal officer has a very uncomfortable set of options, Evelyn said. And I believe that Patterson is not a true believer in Granger's cause. He's a convenience. Convenient men tend to recalculate quickly when the math changes. Whitmore set the ledger down. He looked at Caleb. You've been keeping this record for 4 years. Yes, Caleb said. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Caleb met his eyes. I wrote to you twice. A pause. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. Yes, you did. He said it without defensiveness, which Evelyn respected, the acknowledgement of a man who understood he had dropped something and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I need 2 weeks to review all of this properly and consult with my office. I'm not making promises. But I will tell you that if the Reyes documents are authenticated, if the signatures and dates hold up under examination, then what we have here is not a complaint. It's a case. Evelyn held very still. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, Whitmore said. They rode back out of Cheyenne the next morning, and Evelyn did not let herself feel anything definitive about it on the way home, because she had learned that hope was expensive and she had a limited budget. What she allowed herself was the careful, provisional thought that they had moved from the storage room floor to a federal attorney's desk, and that was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. They were 4 miles out of Silver Creek on the return, coming down off the Ridge Road, when Caleb pulled his horse to a stop. She looked at him. He was looking north, toward his property, toward the mountain. "What?" she said. "Smoke," he said. She looked. It was wrong. Too much of it, too dark, coming from the wrong direction for someone's chimney. It was the kind of smoke that meant something was already beyond saving. Caleb was moving before she finished processing it, and she went after him. The barn was fully involved by the time they arrived. The south wall had already gone and the roof was following it, and the heat hit her at 20 yards like a physical force, a wall of it, pressing her back even as every instinct she had was pushing forward. Caleb was off his horse and running toward the fence line, where two of the cattle were tangled in panic, and she went for the water trough, and then understood immediately that a trough was laughable against what was in front of her and stopped. She stood in the yard and watched the barn burn. There was nothing else to do. It was past any help. The building that Caleb had built with his own hands, that had stood through 4 Wyoming winters, that housed the tack and the feed, and 3 months of stored supplies, was becoming nothing in front of her eyes. Caleb had gotten the cattle loose. He came back to stand beside her. His face was very still. She looked at him. "The horses?" "They were in the south pasture," he said. "They're all right." They stood there for a while without speaking, watching it. The heat was enormous, and the sound of it was constant. That deep eating sound that fire makes when it has enough to work with. "This was Granger," she said. "Yes. He found out about Cheyenne. Or he found out about the families," Caleb said. "Or he didn't find out about anything specific, and he decided it was time to send a message regardless." He paused. "It doesn't change anything except the timetable." She looked at him. His jaw was set, and beneath the stillness she could see the specific kind of anger that lives in people who have learned to keep anger functional rather than explosive. Anger that doesn't waste itself on heat, that gets cold and deliberate and patient instead. "He thinks this will stop us," she said. "He thinks this will scare us," Caleb said. "There's a difference. Scaring someone doesn't require them to stop. It just requires them to think about whether what they're doing is worth what it costs." "Is it?" she said, not challenging, asking. It was his barn, his property, his 4 years of work that had just been answered with fire. He looked at her. "The Reyes family has 2 children," he said. "The Lindqvists have 3. The Calloway widow has been alone on that land for 6 years since her husband died, and Granger has been slowly taking pieces of it because he knew she had nobody to help her fight." He turned back to the fire. "Yes," he said, "it's worth it." She nodded once. They slept that night in the house, which was untouched, whether by design or because the fire had been set for message rather than destruction. She couldn't be sure. And in the morning she rode down to Silver Creek while Caleb began assessing what was salvageable from the barn's edges. She did not go to the sheriff's office. She already knew what that would produce. She went to the general store, where 3 people she recognized were buying supplies, and she told them, clearly and calmly, and in a voice designed to carry to the back of the room, that Malcolm Granger had burned Caleb Ashford's barn last night in response to a federal inquiry into his lending practices, and that if anyone in Silver Creek had ever been treated unfairly by Granger's office, they should know that a federal attorney in Cheyenne was currently reviewing documentation from 11 families and was actively building a case. The store went very quiet. The man behind the counter, his name was Pryor. He'd been in Silver Creek for 15 years and was the kind of man who recorded everything in his head out of habit, said, "You sure about that, Evelyn? That's a serious thing to say." "I know what I'm saying, Hiram," she said. "I said it on purpose." She bought flour and salt and rode back up the mountain. She was 2 miles out when a rider came up behind her fast, too fast for a casual traveler. And she turned in the saddle with her heart rate climbing before she recognized Thomas. He pulled up beside her, breathing hard from the ride, his hat pushed back and his face carrying the particular expression of a 16-year-old who has been sitting on alarming information and has finally decided he can't sit on it anymore. "Evelyn," he said, "there's been a man asking around town about you." She kept riding. "Well, what kind of man?" "I don't know him. Nobody does. He's been in Silver Creek 2 days, staying at the boarding house, asking people where you live, who you're staying with, what you're doing up on the mountain." Thomas pulled his horse alongside hers. Mrs. Pryor told him she didn't know. But the new man at the feed store, Patterson's boy, he was talking to him yesterday afternoon. Patterson's boy. Patterson, who owed Granger a boundary ruling and a neighbor's eviction and 3 years of comfortable silence. "Go home, Thomas," she said. "Evelyn, go home and stay close to the house and don't tell anyone anything about where I am or what I'm doing." She looked at him directly. "You understand me?" He looked at her with the young, complicated face of someone who wants to be involved and is wise enough to know he shouldn't be. "Yeah," he said, "I understand." "Thank you for telling me," she said. That mattered. He turned his horse and went back toward town, and she rode the rest of the way up the mountain with her eyes moving more than usual between the road ahead and the road behind. She told Caleb about the man at the boarding house that evening. He listened without interrupting. "Description?" he said. Thomas said medium height, brown coat, kept to himself, not local. Nobody knew him. "Granger's used men from outside before," Caleb said, "when he needs something done that he doesn't want connected to anyone in Silver Creek." "What kind of something?" A pause. "The Mercer family's barn also burned," Caleb said, "before they went to Kansas. It was ruled accidental." She looked at him. The fire, the outside man, the timing. 2 weeks before their meeting with Whitmore, right as the families were beginning to come forward, right as the machinery Granger had built over decades was beginning to creak under the weight of people who'd stopped being quiet. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes." "Which means he's worried." "Yes," Caleb said again. "But a worried man with his resources is more dangerous than a comfortable one, not less." She knew that. She had known it from the moment she watched him leave her father's kitchen with that piece of paper in his pocket, and the particular look of someone who was rearranging rather than retreating. That night she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote letters. Not to Whitmore. She'd already sent him everything she had. These were to the families. 7 letters, one for each household she'd spoken to, telling them plainly what had happened to the barn, telling them what she'd said in the general store that morning, and telling them that if they were visited by anyone asking questions or making suggestions or applying any kind of pressure, they should write it down, the date, the time, the exact words used, and send it to Caleb's address. She wrote, "What is being done to you is not legal. What is being done to Caleb Ashford is not legal. Every act of intimidation Malcolm Granger commits between now and the federal proceeding is another charge on the list. Do not let fear make you forget that. Do not let him make you smaller than you are." She signed each one with her full name. Caleb read them over her shoulder as she finished the last one. She heard him make a sound that was not quite a word. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "They're good letters." "They're necessary letters," she said, folding them. "There's a difference." She felt him looking at the back of her head for a moment before he moved away, and she filed that away too, in the growing collection of small things she was not yet ready to examine. The response from the families came faster than she expected. Within a week, 4 of the 7 had written back. The Lindqvists reported that a man had come to their door asking whether they'd spoken to anyone about their loan terms, and suggesting that their upcoming payment would be handled more flexibly if they were cooperative. Britta had written cooperative with what at the bottom of the page with 3 question marks, which made Evelyn feel something sharp and warm in her chest. The Calloway widow wrote that nobody had come to her door, but that her fence line on the north side had been cut, cleanly, with tools, not from weather, and 3 of her cattle had gotten through in the night. She had found them 2 miles east by morning, but she wrote, "I know what this is, I am not moving." Martin Reyes did not write. He came in person, riding up the mountain on a Thursday morning with his wife beside him, and his jaw set like a man who has made a decision and dares the world to argue with it. He sat at Caleb's kitchen table and put 3 new pieces of paper on it. "I went back through everything," he said. "Every piece of paper Granger's office ever sent me. I found these." He spread them flat. 3 letters, one from 1880, one from 1881, one from 1882. Each one references the original loan terms. Each one has the 6% figure, the one he told me. Not the 11 that's on the signed document. He looked at Evelyn. He forgot he'd written them, or he thought I'd thrown them away. Evelyn looked at the letters. Her hand went out and touched the paper very carefully, the way you touch something that might not be real if you handle it wrong. "Martin," she said, "these are, I know what they are. he said. He looked steadily at her. You told us not to let him make us smaller. I've been small for 3 years. I'm done with it. His wife reached across and took his hand on the table. He didn't look at her, but his fingers closed around hers. Evelyn looked up and caught Caleb's eyes across the kitchen. Something passed between them. Not a look that needed translation, just the shared, quiet recognition that what was happening in this kitchen right now was real. That it was building. That the thing they had started with a storage room floor and a banker's envelope was becoming something that had weight and momentum, and increasingly, its own life. She looked back at Martin Reyes and his wife and thought about Granger in his office, receiving reports about barn fires and quiet men at boarding houses and fence lines cut in the night, and she thought about the gap between what he believed he was doing and what he was actually doing. He believed he was applying pressure. He was building evidence. Every letter to a family, every man he sent to knock on doors, every fence cut and cattle scattered, every action he took to frighten people into silence was another item on a list that a federal attorney in Cheyenne was going to read in a well-lit room without Malcolm Granger's shadow falling across it. She thought about Whitmore's 2-week timeline, now 4 days away. She thought about the man in the brown coat at the boarding house, and about what he was being paid to find out, and about what he would report back to Granger about what he'd found. She hoped, and she was not a woman who hoped carelessly, that he would report back that Evelyn Hart was not afraid, that the families were not retreating, that the barn had burned, and the fences had been cut, and the answer coming back from the mountain was not silence. She pulled Martin's 3 letters toward her and picked up her pen. She began copying them in her precise, unpretty handwriting because Whitmore needed to see these and he needed to see them before the 14 days were up. And there was no time to waste on anything except the next necessary thing. Outside, the October wind was picking up off the ridge, cold and purposeful, carrying the particular smell of the season, changing from something that could be held back to something that had already arrived. Inside, 3 people sat around a table covered in paper, and none of them were quiet. Whitmore's second letter arrived on a Monday, and it was longer than the first. He had reviewed the Reyes documents with a colleague who specialized in financial instruments, and they were consistent with fraudulent alteration. He had cross-referenced the council session records Caleb had included in the ledger against the territorial filing dates for 3 of Granger's property claims, and found discrepancies that could not be explained by clerical error. He was formally opening a federal inquiry. He would need the families to present themselves in Cheyenne within 30 days to give sworn depositions. He would also need Evelyn Hart to appear as a primary witness. He wrote, near the end, "I want to be direct with you, Miss Hart. What you have assembled here is more thorough than anything my office typically receives from individuals without legal training. I do not say this to flatter you. I say it because you should understand that what happens next will be difficult, and you should enter it with clear eyes about what you are walking into." She read that paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket, where she kept things she needed to think about while her hands were doing other work. Caleb was rebuilding the barn's south wall that morning, not reconstructing the whole structure, just shoring up what was left so the remaining supplies and tools would have cover before the serious cold came. He had been at it since first light with the focused, methodical energy of a man who processes grief through function rather than feeling. She had watched him work for 3 days since the fire without saying much about it, because she understood that some losses needed to be absorbed at a certain pace, and talking about them too directly interrupted the absorption. She brought him coffee and told him about the letter. He listened with his back to her, fitting a board into place, and when she finished reading the key parts aloud, he was quiet for a moment. 30 days, he said. Yes. The families need to make it to Cheyenne. He set down his hammer. Some of them can't leave their property for that long, not in October. The Lindqvists have livestock that won't manage without Henrik, and the Calloway widow can't lock up and walk away, not with her fence already compromised. I know, she said. We'll have to stagger it. Whitmore can take depositions over multiple visits if we explain the situation. But we need to get there first and talk to him in person. She handed him the coffee. And we need to tell the families today, all of them, before Granger hears about the inquiry through whatever channel he has in Cheyenne. He took the coffee and looked at her. You think he has a channel in Cheyenne? He has channels everywhere else, she said. Why would Cheyenne be different? He didn't argue that. They split the visits that day. Caleb rode south toward the Reyes property and two smaller farms beyond it. Evelyn went north to the Lundqvists and then back through Silver Creek to the Calloway place. It was the first time she'd been into town since she'd stood in Hiram Pryor's general store and announced the federal inquiry to anyone within earshot, and she felt the difference in how people looked at her. Not everyone, but enough. The kind of sidelong glance that happens when someone has heard something about you and is deciding whether to believe it and what it means for them if they do. Hiram Pryor himself came out from behind his counter when she came in for tack oil. "Evelyn," he said, low enough that it didn't carry. "Word is Patterson was in Granger's office for 2 hours yesterday. Door closed." She kept her face neutral. "Thank you, Hiram." "I'm not—" He paused. "I don't want trouble. I've got a store to run." "I know that," she said. "But I've got a ledger too," he said. "My own, I mean. I keep records of who pays for what and when, and I've got receipts going back 8 years from families who were buying supplies on Granger's credit at rates Granger set, and I never thought much about it before, but now that you mention—" He stopped again, looked at his hands. "I don't want trouble," he repeated. "But if someone needed records of who was buying on Granger's credit and at what markup, I'd have those." Evelyn set the tack oil on the counter. "Keep them somewhere safe, Hiram," she said quietly. "And if a federal officer named Whitmore contacts you from Cheyenne, talk to him." She paid for the oil and left. Britta Lindqvist took the news about the federal inquiry with the particular calm of someone who had already made their decision and was now simply waiting to act on it. Henrik was less calm. He paced the kitchen twice, stopped, paced it again, but when he stopped the second time, he said, "We'll come to Cheyenne. Whatever week you need us, we'll come." "Your livestock," Evelyn said. "My brother is 2 days east," Henrik said. "He'll come. We'll manage it." She rode on to the Calloway place. Ruth Calloway was 53, a small woman with large hands and gray hair she kept braided tight, and she was mending harness leather on her porch when Evelyn arrived, which was where she seemed to do most of her living. Outdoors, practical, undecorated. She listened to everything Evelyn said without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, Ruth said, "He cut my fence line again last night. North side, same place." Evelyn felt the cold, specific anger she was becoming familiar with. "Did you see anyone?" "No, but I found boot prints that weren't mine and weren't my late husband's. His boots are still in the house. I know the size." She bit off a piece of thread. "I wrote it down. Date, location, measurements of the prints. You said to write things down." "I did," Evelyn said. "I'm glad you did." "I'll come to Cheyenne," Ruth said, in the same tone she might use to say she'd come to a neighbor's canning day, flat and settled. "I've got nothing here worth protecting more than the truth about what was done to me. My husband worked that land for 20 years. Granger's been taking it apart since the funeral." She looked at Evelyn directly, and there was something in her eyes that was past anger. Something that had been burning so long it had become simply the permanent temperature of how she operated. "I want to look at him in a courtroom. I want him to know I'm looking." Evelyn rode home that evening in the last of the light, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from holding other people's pain with enough care that it didn't spill, which was its own kind of labor, and one that nobody usually acknowledged as such. Caleb was on the porch when she arrived. 3 of the families had confirmed. The 4th, a young couple named Dawson, who had the smallest spread of anyone involved, had said they needed another day to decide, which Evelyn understood meant they were scared, which she also understood because of course they were scared. They had a baby under a year old and a loan that Granger could call due at any time and almost no margin for being on the wrong side of anything. "Give them the day," she said. "I did," Caleb said. He paused. "Patterson's been to the Dawsons." She stopped. "When?" "This afternoon, according to their nearest neighbor who saw his wagon." Caleb's voice was even. "He was there for about an hour." She sat down on the porch step. Not from weakness, just because she needed to be still for a moment and process the specific quality of what she was feeling, which was somewhere between fury and the cold, strategic calculation of what Patterson's visit to the Dawsons meant for their timeline. He's pressuring them not to testify, she said. Yes. Which means Granger knows about the inquiry. Yes. She had known this was coming. She had told Caleb it was coming. But knowing it was coming and feeling it arrive were different experiences, and she sat with the difference for a moment before she let the calculation take over from the feeling. Then we're not waiting 30 days, she said. We need to be in Cheyenne in 2 weeks. Whatever depositions we can get in that time, we get. Whatever families can make the journey, we take. We go with what we have. Whitmore said 30 days. Whitmore said 30 days because that's what the standard timeline looked like, she said. The standard timeline assumed Granger wasn't going to spend those 30 days dismantling our witnesses. She looked at Caleb. Write to him tonight. Tell him we need to move. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face in that particular evening light, the last orange of it coming flat and cold across the ridge, that she almost looked at directly, and then didn't, for the same reason she had been filing things away for weeks. Because there was a right time for things, and this was not it. All right, he said, tonight. The Dawsons confirmed the following morning. She didn't know what had changed between Patterson's visit and dawn, and she didn't ask. She accepted it with plain gratitude and wrote it down and moved forward. What she found out later, through Thomas, who had it from a boy in town whose father ran the boarding house, was that the man in the brown coat had left Silver Creek 2 days before, and that before he left he had visited the Dawsons too. Not the same day as Patterson. A different day. And while Patterson had come with Granger's usual message of cooperative flexibility, the man in the brown coat had apparently said something different. He had said, according to the Dawson woman, who told it to her neighbor, who told it to the boarding house man's son, that if the family testified, their loan would be called in full, immediately, and if they couldn't pay, he personally would make sure there was nothing left on their land worth taking. A direct threat, explicit, witnessed by both Dawsons and precise enough that the wife had written it down verbatim on the back of an envelope and hidden it in the flour tin. Evelyn got that envelope 3 days later, and she sent it to Whitmore by express rider the same afternoon she received it. She wrote with it, "This is witness intimidation conducted by an agent of Malcolm Granger. The witness can identify the man. Add it to the list." Whitmore's response came in 4 days, which was fast, and it said, "We are moving to an accelerated schedule. Bring everyone you have. Come as soon as you can travel." They left for Cheyenne on a Wednesday with 6 families, Caleb, Evelyn, and Hiram Pryor's 8 years of credit ledgers wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of a supply trunk. The Calloway widow rode her own horse and would not hear of doing it any other way. The Lindqvists came in their wagon with their 3 children because there was nobody to leave the children with, and Britta refused to leave them behind in a situation that felt uncertain. Martin Reyes had his 3 letters and his wife's hand and the set jaw of a man who had been waiting 3 years for someone to tell him his evidence mattered. It was not a comfortable journey. The weather turned on the second day, and the road became an argument between mud and wheel, and the Dawson baby cried for the better part of an afternoon, and 2 of the horses got into a dispute at camp that required 20 minutes to sort out and left Henrik Lindqvist with a bruised forearm. Nobody complained out loud. There was an understanding that had settled over the group without anyone declaring it. The understanding that what they were doing was necessary and hard, and that the hardness was not a reason to stop. It was simply the texture of the thing. Evelyn rode near the back of the group most of the time, where she could see everyone and where the children from the Lindqvist wagon could ask her questions, which they did at intervals that she privately found steadying. A 6-year-old asking why the mountains were that color was a reasonable question. It was the kind of question that reminded her the world was larger than Malcolm Granger. Caleb rode near the front most of the time, which she also noticed. He was navigating, choosing road, watching the weather. He was also, she understood, putting himself between the group and whatever might be coming from ahead, not dramatically, not consciously perhaps, but in the functional way of someone whose instincts ran in that direction and who didn't feel the need to announce it. On the 3rd evening, when the camp was settled and the children were asleep in the Lindqvist wagon and Martin Reyes was on first watch by his own insistence, Evelyn found herself sitting by the fire next to Ruth Calloway and not talking for a while, which was the kind of company she had rarely had, someone who didn't need the silence filled. Ruth said, after a long time, "How long have you known Ashford?" A few months, Evelyn said. Ruth made a small sound that wasn't quite skeptical and wasn't quite knowing. Something in between. He asked about your family, Ruth said. Before all this, years before. He came through my place once, checking his south fence line, and he stopped to water his horse and we talked for a bit, the way you do. He asked about the families along the creek. She paused. He asked about the Hart specifically, how Robert was managing, how you were getting on. Evelyn looked at the fire. When was this? She said. 5 years ago, maybe, Ruth said. Maybe 6. 5 or 6 years ago, Evelyn had been 21 or 22, running her father's ranch on borrowed energy and borrowed time, mending fences she hadn't made and solving problems she hadn't created. She had never met Caleb Ashford. She had not known his name. She sat with that for a moment. He didn't say anything about why he was asking, Ruth said. It was not quite a question. No, Evelyn said. He wouldn't. Ruth nodded as though that confirmed something she'd already suspected and went back to being quiet. Whitmore met them in the lobby of the Federal Building on a gray November morning, and he shook every hand. The Lindqvists, the Reyes, the Dawsons, Ruth Calloway, Hiram Pryor, the 2 smaller farm families who'd come at the last moment when word had spread through their community that people were actually going. He looked at the group assembled in the lobby of his building, and Evelyn saw him recalibrate. She could see it in the adjustment of his spectacles, the brief pause before he spoke, because she suspected he had expected something smaller and less determined. We'll need 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. We have them, Evelyn said. The depositions were taken in a room with a long table and a clerk who wrote everything down, and 2 of Whitmore's colleagues who asked questions with the careful, patient specificity of people who had learned not to rush testimony, because rushing it produced testimony you had to use carefully. Each family went separately. Evelyn sat outside the room with whoever was waiting and said very little, because there was nothing useful she could add at that point. They knew their own stories better than she did, had lived them better than she had, and what they needed from her now was not guidance, but simply the knowledge that someone was outside the door. Ruth Calloway was in the room the longest, 1 hour and 40 minutes. When she came out, her face was the same dry-eyed steadiness it always was, but she sat down next to Evelyn, and for exactly 30 seconds she put her hand over her own mouth, like she was containing something, and then she took her hand away and looked straight ahead. Evelyn did not ask. She just stayed where she was. After a moment, Ruth said, They asked me to describe the day he sent someone to tell me that my husband's medical debts were going to be attached to the land title if I didn't agree to accelerated repayment. She was quiet. I described it. Good, Evelyn said. It was a long time ago, Ruth said. I didn't know it could still... She stopped. Never mind. It can still, Evelyn said. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have said it. Ruth nodded once, and they sat there together until the next family was called. Evelyn's own deposition was on the second day, and Whitmore conducted it himself. He took her through everything. The morning Granger arrived at her father's house, the exact language of the document, the sequence of events, the ledger she had found in Caleb's storage room, every conversation she'd had with every family, the barn fire, the man in the brown coat, the fence lines cut in the night. She told it cleanly, without theatrical emphasis or self-pity or the kind of anger that makes testimony feel personal rather than factual. She had been talking about these things long enough that she knew how to present them in a way that made the facts do the work. When she finished the central account, Whitmore looked up from his notes. Miss Hart, I want to ask you something outside the formal record for a moment. She nodded. When Granger placed that document on your father's table, he said, and your father's hand moved toward the pen, in that moment, what did you intend to do? She looked at him. I intended to sign it myself, she said. If I had to. Whitmore held very still. To protect your family, he said. To prevent my mother from losing her home and my brother from losing his future, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And instead, Mr. Ashford arrived. Yes. And you went up the mountain. Yes. And you found the ledger. Yes. And you did all of the rest of this. He gestured at the table between them, covered in documents and statements and 8 years of Hiram Pryor's credit records. Yes, she said. Whitmore took off his spectacles. He cleaned them. He put them back. The formal record resumes, he said, and continued. On the third evening, Whitmore gathered them all in a larger room and told them what the inquiry had established and what came next. He spoke plainly, which she appreciated. He did not soften it or dramatize it, just laid out the shape of it. The documented evidence supported charges of loan fraud across multiple counts, falsification of county records, interference with territorial land rights, and witness intimidation. Gerald Patterson had been contacted by a federal officer that afternoon, not Whitmore himself, a colleague, and had been informed of his potential exposure. Patterson had immediately requested to speak with a lawyer, which Whitmore said, with the careful absence of expression that lawyers used for things they found significant, was a reasonable response that often preceded cooperation. Granger will be served with a federal summons, Whitmore said. He will have legal representation, and he will contest everything, so I want to be direct with you. This will take time. Federal proceedings are not fast. There will be a period between now and the actual court date during which he remains free and during which his motivation to interfere with witnesses remains high. I want each of you to understand that. The room was quiet. Henrik Lindqvist said, "How long?" 4 to 6 months before trial, Whitmore said. Possibly longer. 4 to 6 months. Evelyn looked around the room at the faces. The Lindqvists, Ruth Calloway, Martin Reyes with his wife's hand in his, the Dawsons with their baby asleep against its mother's shoulder. She thought about Granger receiving a federal summons, and she thought about what a man who had burned a barn and cut fence lines and sent someone to threaten a family with an infant did when the thing he'd been trying to prevent became real. He'll escalate, she said. Whitmore looked at her. That is a possibility. It's not a possibility, she said. It's what he does when he's losing control of something. We've seen it 3 times already. She looked around the room. You all need to document everything. Every conversation you didn't choose to have, every person on your property you didn't invite, every piece of your land that's disturbed in a way that wasn't natural. Write it down, date it, send it to Whitmore's office. She paused. And nobody rides alone if they can help it. Nobody argued with her. That told her something about how far they had come from the first conversation in the Lindqvist kitchen when Britta's hands had gone still and the clock had ticked and the word federal had made her flinch. They started back the following morning. The journey home was quieter than the journey out, which was not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet of people who had said difficult things out loud and were now carrying the relief of having said them alongside the weight of what came next. The Lindqvist children slept most of the first day. Ruth Calloway rode her own horse and looked at the road ahead with eyes that had something in them that hadn't been there before. Not peace exactly, but the specific quality of a woman who has finally put down a thing she'd been carrying in silence for too long. On the second day, coming back up the ridge road toward Silver Creek, Caleb rode up beside Evelyn, and they went at the same pace for a while without talking. Then he said, "You told Whitmore you were going to sign it yourself." She glanced at him. He asked, "I know." A pause. "I didn't know that you'd decided that." "It was the only reasonable option," she said. "My mother was sick. Thomas was 16. What was I supposed to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. I'm not criticizing. I just didn't know." She looked at him. His face in profile was doing the careful containment thing, but she had been reading him long enough now that the containment was legible to her. What was underneath it? The specific quality of what he was holding still. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "What did you ask Ruth Calloway about my family 5 or 6 years ago?" He held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't perform surprise because Caleb Ashford did not perform things. He just absorbed the question and sat with it for a moment. "I asked how you were managing," he said. "Why?" The ridge road curved, and for a moment the mountains were directly in front of them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have existed long enough not to need your opinion of them. "Because I'd seen you," he said, "riding the fence line. 2 years before, maybe 3. You were alone and it was February and the ice was bad that year. You fixed 3 posts by yourself in a morning. He paused. I almost stopped. Why didn't you? Because you didn't need stopping for, he said. You were managing fine. Another pause. And because I didn't know how to explain why I'd stopped, what I'd say. She turned that over slowly, the way you turn something over when you want to look at every side of it before you decide what it is. How long? She said. He didn't ask what she meant. 7 years, he said, give or take. 7 years. She had been 20 or thereabouts, riding fence in February ice, and this man had been on a parallel ridge somewhere, almost stopping, not stopping, carrying something he apparently hadn't known how to explain. She thought about the key in her palm on her first day on the mountain, the envelope on the kitchen table that had saved her name from a piece of paper, the ledger in the storage room, and 4 years of patient, careful documentation, and the 2 letters he'd sent to Whitmore that had gone unanswered, and the 3rd one that hadn't. She thought about Ruth Calloway saying he asked about the heart specifically on a cold evening by a campfire, and the way she'd said it, like someone confirming a thing they had already understood. She did not say anything for a long moment. The road curved again, and Silver Creek appeared below them, small and specific in the afternoon, the smoke from its chimneys going straight up in the cold, still air. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, she said again. We can talk about it. Later. When this is finished. I'm not asking for... I know you're not, she said. That's not why I said it. She looked at him directly. I said it because it deserves more than a sentence on a ridge road, and because right now we have a federal case to hold together for 4 to 6 months against a man who is about to become significantly more dangerous. She paused. But after. He held her gaze. Something in his face did the thing it did, and this time she let herself look at it, briefly and without flinching. After, he said. They rode down toward Silver Creek with the families behind them, and the cold coming in off the mountains and everything that needed doing still ahead of them, and neither of them said anything more about it, because they were both people who understood that some things were worth waiting for if you did the waiting right. What Evelyn did not know, coming down that ridge road in the late November light, was that Granger had received his federal summons that morning, that he had read it in his office with his door closed and then sat very still for exactly 4 minutes, which his clerk knew because the clerk had been counting, frightened by the stillness, and that when Granger finally moved, he had picked up his pen and written a single name on a piece of paper and handed it to the man who was always waiting by the side door, not Caleb's name, not the name of any of the families. Evelyn's. The name on Granger's piece of paper did not stay a secret long. It reached Caleb through Thomas, who heard it from Hiram Pryor, who had it from a woman who cleaned Granger's office 3 mornings a week, and who had been listening through doors long before anyone asked her to. The message was not elaborate. It did not need to be. It said simply that Granger intended to discredit Evelyn Hart before the trial date, to build a case that she was a woman of unstable character who had manufactured evidence and coerced frightened families into false statements, driven by personal grievance over the incident at her father's house. It was not a physical threat. That was almost worse. A physical threat you could defend against in obvious ways. This was the kind of attack that worked slowly and invisibly, that spread through a community the way water spreads through cracked ground, not dramatically, just persistently, until the damage was structural. Caleb told her on a Thursday evening, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands the way he stood when he was delivering something he didn't want to deliver. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, "He's going to try to make the case about me instead of about him." Yes. Which means everything I've said, every family I've spoken to, every piece of documentation, he's going to argue it was all motivated by personal grievance and manufactured by a woman who was humiliated and wanted revenge. That's what Whitmore thinks he's building toward, Caleb said. He sent a message this morning. Granger's lawyer has already filed a motion questioning the integrity of witness collection. She sat down. Not from shock, from the need to think horizontally rather than vertically, to spread the problem out in her mind and look at its edges. He's not wrong that I have personal grievance, she said. Evelyn, I'm not saying he's right. I'm saying he's not wrong about that specific thing, and a good lawyer will make that sound like the same thing as bias. She looked at her hands on the table. The question is whether the evidence stands without me, whether the Reyes documents and the Lindqvist testimony and Ruth Calloway's account and Hiram's credit ledgers are enough on their own without my word at the center of it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Whitmore thinks they are. What do you think? He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. I think the evidence is real and it stands on its own. And I think Granger knows that, which is why he's going after you personally rather than the evidence directly. You can't manufacture Martin Reyes's 2 copies of the same document with different numbers. You can't manufacture 8 years of Hiram's credit records. He paused. What he can do is make you the issue. Make the jury spend so much time deciding what to think about you that they lose sight of what the documents say. She understood that. She had understood it from the moment Caleb said Granger's lawyer had filed the motion, because it was a logical move. It was actually what she would have done if she were defending someone with a mountain of evidence against them and a limited number of options. Then I have to be unimpeachable on the stand, she said. Not perfect. Unimpeachable. She looked at him. There's a difference. Perfect sounds prepared. Unimpeachable is just someone who tells the exact truth and doesn't apologize for it. You've been doing that since September, he said. I know, she said. I just have to keep doing it in a room where he's watching. She wrote to Whitmore that night. She told him she was aware of Granger's strategy and that she had a proposal. She wanted to go over her testimony with him not to rehearse it, but to identify every place where her personal grievance was visible and make sure the factual record around it was airtight. Not to hide the grievance, she wasn't going to pretend she didn't have one, but to make sure that every factual claim she made was supported by something that existed independently of her. Whitmore wrote back in 6 days. He said, "Come to Cheyenne. Bring Ashford. We have work to do." The months between November and the March trial date were not quiet, but they were different from what came before. Less fire, more friction. Granger's lawyer filed 3 more motions. Whitmore's office answered each one. The back and forth had a grinding procedural quality that Evelyn found exhausting in a way that barn fires and cut fences hadn't been. Because at least those were concrete. Legal procedure was a war of attrition conducted in language designed to obscure rather than clarify, and she had to learn enough of it to understand what was being done to their case and whether the responses were adequate. She learned it. She read every filing Whitmore sent her. She wrote back with questions, and Whitmore answered them with the patient thoroughness of a man who had initially underestimated his witness and was now making up for it. Gerald Patterson broke in January. It happened faster than any of them expected. A federal officer had interviewed him twice, and after the second interview, Patterson had apparently gone home, sat in his kitchen for 2 hours, and then ridden to Whitmore's Cheyenne office without an appointment and asked to speak with someone. He had brought documentation of his own, not much, but specific. A letter from Granger written in 1880 that referenced the boundary dispute ruling in terms that made the arrangement between them explicit enough that no reasonable person could call it coincidence. Patterson was offered a reduced exposure in exchange for full cooperation. He took it. Evelyn heard about it from Whitmore and felt something she was not expecting, which was not triumph, but something more complicated. A kind of tired relief. And underneath it, a flicker of something almost like pity for Patterson. Not much, but a little. He was not a brave man or a good one, but he had been trapped in Granger's machinery for long enough that the machinery had become the shape of his life, and dismantling it meant dismantling something he'd built his stability on. That was not nothing, even for a man who'd made bad choices. She did not say this to anyone except Ruth Calloway on a cold February afternoon when Ruth had ridden up the mountain to bring a jar of preserved pears because she said she'd made too many and someone needed to take them. Ruth listened and said, "You can feel a little sorry for someone and still need them to be held responsible. Those aren't the same bucket." "No," Evelyn agreed, "they're not. My husband used to say that the measure of a person wasn't whether they felt complicated things. It was what they did after they felt them." Ruth handed over the pears. "You've done right by what you felt." Evelyn took the jar. She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. The trial opened on the 9th of March in the federal courthouse in Cheyenne. In a room with high ceilings and windows that let in a flat gray winter light and benches filled with people Evelyn didn't entirely expect. Journalists from 2 territorial papers, A number of faces she didn't recognize who she later learned were observers from the Federal Land Office, and in the back row, sitting straight-backed and still, her father. She had not told Robert Hart to come. She had not told him not to. He had come on his own, 2 days' journey, which meant he had made that decision without being asked and without knowing whether she wanted him there, and she felt the complexity of that in her chest. The damage that still lived there alongside the fact that he had made the journey, and she let both things be true without resolving them. She did not go speak to him before she was called. There would be time for that after, or there wouldn't, and either way the courtroom was not the place. Granger sat at the defense table in a suit that cost more than most of the families in the room earned in a year. He looked older than she remembered, or perhaps she was just seeing him differently now. Not as the man who had walked into her family's kitchen with authority that filled the room, but as what he actually was, which was a man who had spent decades building a structure designed to make other people feel powerless, and who was now sitting in a room where that structure was about to be examined in daylight. He looked at her once when she entered the courtroom. His expression did not change. Neither did hers. Martin Reyes testified first. He was calm and specific, laying out the loan terms as he'd been told them, and then the loan terms as they appeared in writing, with the 3 letters from Granger's own office that confirmed the original verbal rate. Granger's lawyer cross-examined him for 40 minutes and found no purchase. Martin had lived with these documents for 3 years and knew every word of them better than he knew most things. The Lindqvists went together, which Whitmore had arranged deliberately because Henrik's account and Britta's account corroborated each other at every specific point. And 2 people remembering the same conversation in the same detail is harder to dismiss than one. Ruth Calloway took the stand and described every interaction with Granger's representatives over 6 years with the flat precision of someone who had written it all down at the time and had not forgotten a syllable of it. When Granger's lawyer suggested that her memory might be colored by grief following her husband's death, she looked at him steadily and said, "My grief is my own business. My records are in your hand right now." The courtroom was very quiet for a moment after that. Patterson testified on the second day. He did not look at Granger during his testimony, which was noted by everyone in the room. He described the council session and the boundary ruling and the letter he had brought Whitmore, and his voice was the flat voice of a man burning something down that he'd spent years tending, which was appropriate. Hiram Pryor was on the stand for most of the third morning, walking through 8 years of credit records with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had kept good books and knew exactly what they said. The pattern that emerged from his testimony was not dramatic. It was arithmetic, which was somehow worse, because arithmetic doesn't lie and doesn't respond to a lawyer's objections. Evelyn was called on the 4th day. She walked to the stand with the awareness that the room was watching her, and that Granger's lawyer had spent 4 days building toward this moment, toward the argument that everything she had assembled was personal, vindictive, the work of a wronged woman with an axe to grind. She sat down. She looked at Whitmore. He gave her a small nod. She told the truth. She told it plainly, in order, starting from the morning she had seen Granger's buggy coming up the road, and ending with the letter she'd received from Whitmore that had opened the inquiry. She did not perform emotion, but she did not suppress it either. When she described the line on her father's kitchen table, the line with her name on it and the word surrender, her voice changed slightly, the way anyone's voice changes when they say a thing out loud that they have lived. She didn't apologize for that. She let it be what it was. Granger's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and began carefully to build the picture of a woman driven by grievance. He asked about her relationship with Caleb Ashford. He asked about the money Caleb had paid to relieve her family's debt. He asked whether she stood to benefit personally from Granger's conviction. She answered each question directly. Yes, Caleb Ashford paid my family's debt. I did not ask him to, and I did not know he was going to. Yes, I live and work on his ranch. I receive fair wages for honest labor. Yes, my family benefits if Granger cannot pursue my father's former property. So does every other family in this room, for the same reason. Then the lawyer said, "Miss Hart, isn't it true that your motivation for pursuing this case was primarily the humiliation you suffered when your father's financial arrangements became known?" She looked at him. "My father's financial arrangements," she said carefully, included a document that proposed to transfer legal custody of a 27-year-old woman to a man who had targeted her family for years, in exchange for erasing a debt that had been structured specifically to be unrepayable. If I experienced humiliation, it was because a person with a great deal of power treated me as though I had none. She paused. But the Reyes family wasn't humiliated by my father's arrangements. Ruth Calloway wasn't humiliated by my father's arrangements. Henrik and Britta Lindqvist weren't humiliated by my father's arrangements. She looked at the jury. They were each wronged in their own specific way, with their own specific documentation, across a span of 12 years. I assembled the record. I did not invent it. The courtroom was still. The lawyer had no follow-up question. He sat down. Whitmore did not redirect. He didn't need to. She stepped down from the stand and walked back to her seat without looking at Granger, because she had decided 3 days ago that she would not look at him during the verdict either, and she wanted to practice the discipline of it. He had looked at her as a thing to be managed, contained, discredited, used. She was going to give him as little of her attention as his choices deserved, which was none. The jury was out for 7 hours. She spent most of it outside the courthouse in the cold March air, sitting on the steps with her coat on, because the inside of the building had begun to feel like a held breath, and she needed actual air. Caleb sat beside her. They didn't talk much. At one point, Thomas appeared from around the corner with 3 cups of coffee that he'd gotten from somewhere and handed them out with the careful seriousness of a 17-year-old trying to be useful in a situation that was beyond his ability to fix, which was all of them. She took the coffee. She looked at her brother, taller than she'd registered somehow. Or maybe she hadn't been looking closely enough, and felt a sudden, specific rush of feeling for him that had nothing to do with the case. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, the way teenage boys shrug when they're moved by something and have not yet learned how to just let it show. "It's just coffee." "Thomas," she said. "Yeah." "You fixed the north fence post." He looked surprised that she knew. "Last month, Henrik showed me how to do the anchor correctly." "Good," she said. "That's good." He sat down on her other side, and the 3 of them drank their coffee on the courthouse steps and waited. The verdict came back guilty on 11 counts. Fraud across multiple loans, falsification of county records, interference with territorial land rights, conspiracy to commit witness intimidation. The foreman read each count in a voice that was loud enough to fill the room and left no interpretive room in any direction. Evelyn listened to all 11 counts and felt something she had not fully anticipated, which was that the verdict did not feel like an ending. It felt like the last heavy thing being set down after a very long carry. Not joyful exactly, but the specific physical relief of a weight released. She had been braced for something longer, something harder, and instead the room was just reading words out loud that matched what the evidence said, which was what she had always believed would happen if someone in a position of authority would simply look. The sentencing was immediate on the most severe counts. Granger was to be held pending the full sentencing hearing, his assets frozen, his property claims against the 12 families vacated, effective immediately. The council appointments made under his influence were referred to the territorial governor for review. Patterson received a suspended sentence and 5 years of supervised reporting to the federal court. Granger was let out through a side door. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the families. He had, she realized, the expression of a man who had understood for some time that this was a possible outcome and had prepared for it internally in whatever way such men prepare, by deciding that other people's judgment of him was simply not a thing he was required to respect. She watched him go and thought, that is the real thing he never understood, that his opinion of his own power was not the same thing as actual power, that a system built on other people's silence is only stable for as long as the silence holds. And silence, she had learned, was not a permanent condition in people who still had something to lose. You just had to give them a reason to speak. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered in the gray March afternoon, and there was a moment, not organized, not planned, where everyone just stood in proximity to each other and breathed. The Lindqvist children ran on the frozen grass. Martin Reyes put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him with the particular lean of someone who has been holding themselves upright under pressure and has just been given permission to rest. Ruth Calloway stood with her hands in her coat pockets and her face turned up slightly toward the pale sky, not smiling exactly, but with something around her eyes that hadn't been there in September. Robert Hart appeared at Evelyn's elbow. She had not heard him approach. She looked at him, at the face she'd been angry at and hurt by and had loved for 27 years regardless, and waited. "I drove the wagon," he said. "Took 2 days." "I know," she said. "Your mother sent preserves," he said. He held up a paper-wrapped package, slightly awkwardly. "She said you'd need something from home." She took the package. She held it for a moment. "Dad?" she said. "I know," he said. "I know, Evelyn. I'm not going to say I had a good reason, because I didn't. I had a reason. It wasn't good." He looked at the courthouse steps, the families, the gray sky. "You did something I couldn't have done. Any of this. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him for a long moment. "We have a lot to talk about," she said. "Not today." "No," he agreed. "Not today." "But soon. Whenever you're ready," he said. And she heard in his voice the understanding that whenever she was ready might be a long time from now, and that he had accepted that. She nodded. He nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, not fully, maybe not completely for a long time, but it was the door left open, which was its own kind of decision. The rebuilding of the barn took 3 weeks in April, when the ground softened enough to work. It was not done by Caleb alone. The Lindqvists came up the mountain one Saturday with Heinrich and 2 of his brother's sons, and the Reyes family the following weekend, and on the last weekend, Thomas came with 2 friends from Silver Creek who were 17 and strong and willing to work in exchange for a meal, which Evelyn provided without comment about the quality of the arrangement. She worked alongside all of them, not because she had to, but because it was her place too now, this mountain, this land, and there was something in the act of building that she needed to be part of. She was not good with the heavy framing work, but she was precise and consistent with the smaller joinery, and Caleb, who was good at most of it, said nothing except once, when she set a joint and he looked at it and said, "That's cleaner than mine." "I had a good teacher," she said. "You had a mediocre one and improved on the instruction," he said, which was the Caleb Ashford version of a compliment, and she had learned to receive those. The night the barn was finished, when the last of the volunteers had ridden down the mountain and the April evening had come in cold and clear and sharp-smelling with the particular freshness of spring at elevation, she stood in the doorway of the new south wall and looked at what had been rebuilt. It was not the same as what had been there before. The wood was newer, the angles slightly different, the whole structure a few feet longer than the original because they'd had the materials and it made sense to expand while they were at it. It was not a restoration. It was something that had been destroyed and had come back as a different version of itself, which was maybe more honest anyway. She heard Caleb behind her. She didn't turn. He stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the barn with the expression of someone evaluating structural integrity, which she knew was only partly what he was doing. "You said after," he said. "I did," she said. "This feels like after." She looked at the barn. At the new wood, the solid joints, the door that hung true on its hinges. At the south pasture beyond it, the cattle moving slow and dark against the last light. "It does," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things. You probably know that by now." "I've noticed," she said. "I'm going to say it anyway," he said, "because I've been not saying it for 7 years, and that's long enough." A pause. "I don't want you here because you owe me something. I don't want you here because you needed somewhere to go. I want you here because this place is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I'd like—" He stopped, tried again. "I'd like to keep building things. With you, if that's something you want." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomfortable honesty of a man who has just said a true thing and is waiting to find out what it costs. She thought about the morning she had ridden up this mountain with one bag and no certainty. About the key placed in her palm without ceremony. About the ledger on the storage room floor and the families around the kitchen table and the courthouse steps with bad coffee and 11 counts read aloud in a room full of people who had stopped being quiet. She thought about the word after and what it meant. Not the end of the story, just the end of the crisis, and the beginning of the long, ordinary work of making a life out of what was left. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean to avoid a silence, so she thought about what was true, and then she said it. I stopped thinking of this as somewhere I was staying temporarily about 6 weeks in, she said. I didn't say so because there was too much else happening. She held his gaze. Yes, I want to keep building things. He exhaled. That same slow, quiet sound she'd heard months ago on the porch, the sound of someone releasing something they'd been holding for too long. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They stood in the doorway of the rebuilt barn in the April dark and did not say anything more profound than that, because they were both people who understood that the profundity was already in the plain words, and adding to them would only make them smaller. They married in June, on the mountain, with the families and Thomas and Robert Hart and Ruth Calloway and Hiram Pryor and the Lindqvist children who ran through the ceremony at intervals because nobody had told them not to. It was not an elegant occasion. The food was too much, and the seating was improvised, and at one point it rained for 20 minutes with no warning, and everyone got slightly wet, and it didn't matter at all. Her father walked her to where Caleb was standing. He did it quietly, without speech, and she let him, because some things between people resolve not in conversations but in actions, in the small dignities that people extend to each other when they've decided to keep going. She had not fully forgiven him. She might not, entirely, for a long time. But she had decided that forgiveness was not a door you either opened or kept shut. It was a room you returned to over and over, each time finding it slightly different than the time before, until one day you realized the room felt like yours. She was working on it. The restored land went back to the families in the month following Granger's sentencing, as the court's orders were executed and the fraudulent liens were vacated one by one. The Reyes family added to their pasture. The Calloway widow repaired her north fence line and planted a windbreak of young trees along it that would take years to grow into anything useful, but she planted them anyway because she intended to be there when they did. The Lindqvists paid off the remainder of their legitimate loan, the real rate, the one they'd actually agreed to. And Henrik came up the mountain one afternoon specifically to tell Caleb the number and shake his hand, which Caleb received with his usual economy of expression and which meant more than either of them put into words. Patterson's cooperation led to 2 additional federal reviews in neighboring counties, where the same pattern of fraudulent loan instruments had been used by associates of Granger's. Both resulted in indictments. Whitmore sent Evelyn a brief note about it that ended, "You built something that reached further than Silver Creek. I thought you should know." She kept the note in the same place she kept the key, which she still had, still carried, not because she needed it anymore, but because it reminded her of something she didn't want to forget. That freedom begins not with the absence of difficulty, but with the presence of a choice. That the most dangerous thing a powerful person can do to you is make you believe you have no options, because the moment you believe that, they don't have to do anything else. That silence is not the same as safety, and the truth is not fragile. It doesn't need protection. It needs witnesses, and witnesses need someone willing to knock on their door and say, "What was done to you matters, and I'm listening." She stood by the rebuilt barn on a July evening, watching the last light go off the ridge, and she was not standing there thinking about Granger or the trial or the 12 families or any of it particularly. She was thinking about the evening meal she was going to make, and the fence section on the east pasture that needed work before autumn, and the letter she owed Ruth Calloway, and whether the garden was going to produce enough for preserves this year. She was thinking about ordinary things. Caleb came out of the house and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not move away from it. "East fence needs work," she said. "I know," he said. "Tomorrow. Tonight if there's light enough." He looked at the ridge. "There's light enough?" She nodded and walked toward the fence line, and he followed, and the mountain held them both in the way that land holds the people who are willing to work it, not gently, not easily, but honestly, with the particular permanence of things that are earned rather than given. There was no dramatic transformation. The frontier did not become a different place overnight. Fear did not vanish from Silver Creek the morning the verdict came in. People were still cautious, still slow to trust, still carrying the marks of what they'd lived under for a long time. But something had shifted in the weight of the air, the way things shift after a long storm. Not clean, not complete, but different. A window open where there had been none. A possibility that had not existed before. That was enough. That was in the end what courage actually produced. Not a perfect world, but an altered one. Not the absence of difficulty, but a different set of difficulties. Ones chosen freely, faced together, worked through one fence post at a time. The aspen trees on the ridge turned gold again in October, as they always did, vivid and brief, carrying no memory of the previous year's turning, concerned only with the current season. Evelyn watched them from the east-facing window of the room that was no longer just hers, but which she thought of as starting there. That room, that window, that morning light, the key placed in a palm without ceremony by a man who had understood, before she did, that the most important thing he could offer another person was not rescue. It was room.